You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm Osman Butt. Israel is at the core of Jewish identity worldwide, or at least this is the idea many within the Israeli government and its supporters wish to convey. One of the most important Jewish communities worldwide is in America, where, according to the Jewish Electoral Commission, a generational divide has emerged. 34% of American Jews agreed with the statement that Israel's treatment of Palestinians was similar to racism in the United States, and 22% agreed that Israel was committing genocide against Palestinians. When broken down for age, 43% thought Israel's treatment of Palestinians was similar to racism in the US, and 33% agreed Israel was committing genocide among the under 40s. So a generational chasm is opening up between American Jews and the state of Israel. My guest today is Simone Zimmerman. Simone is the co-founder of, if not now, a grassroots organization mobilizing the American Jewish community against the Israeli occupation of Gaza and calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Simone was featured in a film, Israelism, in 2023, which is currently touring and follows her and an American veteran of the Israeli military, Itan, as they turn against Israel's occupation of the Palestinians and question the support for Israel among US Jews. Simone, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
And it's our pleasure to have you. So I sort of want to start right at the beginning for you. You're somebody who, were you born in the US, you were raised in the US, and you grew up as a part of the Jewish community in the US. So I'm wondering if you sort of can give us a sense of what did Israel mean to you as you were growing up?
Absolutely. So, my story and the story of my family is in some ways very typical of the story of, Jewish migration over the last century. On one side of my family, my grandfather was born in Warsaw, Poland, and his family were one of the only ones in their extended family who escaped Poland before the Holocaust. And on the other side of my family, one of my grandfathers was a soldier in World War II, a Jewish soldier in World War II who actually helped liberate the camps as part of the Allied forces. And for me, Israel, the story that I was told about Israel growing up was that Israel was the logical conclusion, the logical next step, but also a miraculous turn of history after the horrors that our people had faced in Europe. It was natural. It was a miracle that this safe haven was established for Jews who had no place to go after the Holocaust. And I grew up with a very deep sense of pride in Israel. It was a place where it was possible to be Jewish in a different kind of way because you're surrounded by other Jewish people, and where the state and its institutions promote Judaism, Jewish culture, Jewish community. And of course, the American Jewish community has invested billions of dollars in fostering those exchanges and those connections, right? Sending youth trips to Israel, Israel education, building those very deep ties between our communities and giving young Jews the opportunity to develop a Jewish identity that is rooted in experiences in Israel.
So it was obviously, there's a strong emotional tie to the idea of Israel, as you're saying, because on the one hand, you have the idea that this was a safe haven, which is obviously a very, important idea, but also the sense that you're surrounded by other people who happen to be Jewish and share, share similar traditions to you, similar ideas to you. So I wonder if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about that. That's a feeling that many have when they first go to places like Israel, like what they're expecting to see.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I also just want to say that for many of us, this is also like our extended families. I have extended family who live there. So, at this point, half of the world, the two largest Jewish communities in the world are in the US and Israel. So there's a lot of quite like direct, literal family ties to between these communities. But yeah, I mean, the experience of having traditions that you observe at home and in your smaller communities, and then you go to this place where those traditions are everywhere. The symbolism is all over the place. I think growing up, I mean, I had a wonderful experience growing up as an American Jew. I really cherished, the experience of America's a great place to be a Jew. Let me just say that. And the religious freedom that we have here, the religious diversity. It's a different experience though to like really see this, your symbols everywhere in the public space. When you're, in America, we're used to just seeing Christmas everywhere, for example, in the winter, right? And in Israel, you see Hanukkah everywhere. And of course, the thing that they don't tell us in that story is that is actually created at the exclusion of another group of people who have been erased from the public sphere in order for Jewish domination, that the dominance of Jewish symbols to be everywhere.
Yeah, and this is an interesting time to sort of bring this up. So, when thinking about when you were growing up, did Palestinians feature at all in your imagination and the imaginations of others around you?
In my imagination, certainly, but very much in a racist imagination. I knew very little about Palestinians. I knew very little about Palestinians growing up. They featured in my imagination mostly as this kind of like abstract, scary threat to my safety and well-being. I mostly just knew that, I think I knew that there was a conflict, and I heard that, the Palestinians were trying to kill us all, basically.
So it was from a very young age that you did have an idea about Palestinians, even if it was this sense of like threat. And so I'm sort of also sort of wondering, because a lot of people do wonder this among Palestinians, among Arabs and others, there's a sense that, if things like what's happening, say, in Gaza right now, when we think about October 7th or whatever, do people not think that there's a reason why this violence is happening, or is it just Palestinians are there and they're violent and there's no need to understand? Now, as you're growing up, is that the sort of, if you understand my question?
Sorry, do you mean about October 7th or just in general?
No, just in general, I mean, sorry, because there is an idea that people have struggled to understand, which is the idea that, the fact that if Palestinians or whatever when they do carry, whether it's any kind of resistance or whether it's violence or whatever it is, a tendency to sort of see it as just violent Arabs, not there's any particular reason for doing it. I'm sort of wondering about, growing up, what reasons were you given for all of this?
Yeah, well, look, the state of Israel was built on the dispossession and erasure of the Palestinian people. And I think pro-Israel propaganda efforts very much mirror that. So Palestinians don't really feature in any real fleshed out way in those conversations. Palestinian, we don't really learn much about Palestinian history, Palestinian experiences, Palestinian claims. And so anything that, is Palestinians kind of advocating for their own rights and freedoms or articulating grievances against the Israeli state, I had no context to understand any of those things because, I mean, I was just taught that was, this irrational hatred of us. And, it's all unfair, it's all biased. There's really not a framework for engaging substantively in any meaningful way with the Palestinian experience.
And I think it's also important to highlight for the audience that for Israel, the American Jewish community is incredibly important. I mean, for example, if you haven't been to Israel and you're under the age of, I think it's 30, 34, you get to go on what is called a birthright trip to Israel, which is effectively an all expenses paid trip to Israel for what, 2 weeks?
Yeah, it's 10 days. That's what I was mentioning earlier, that there was this effort in order to kind of revitalize Jewish identity around the world. They decided that it would make sense to invest in these all expense paid trips where young Jews can go. It's this super intensive experience. You're not sleeping, you're traveling, you're bonding with other Jews, and all in Israel. So you see your identity development as a Jewish person happens in that place, and that's what they want you to feel.
It's a great question, actually. From what I understand, the Birthright Israel, that's partially funded by the State Department, or is it paid for by the Israeli government? Do we know who pays for it?
It's not paid for by the United States. No. The Israeli government, I do believe, um, is involved in Birthright. It's primarily American Jewish philanthropic funding.
Okay. Yeah, but it's a very, very, as you said, very important thing that, a lot of people get to do if you're Jewish and particularly from the US. But I wonder now, you sort of told us, you gave us a very good idea, I think, about what growing up was like. But how did your perception shift from seeing Israel as this, wonderful safe haven, a place of security, promised land, but also, a thriving Jewish culture? How did you sort of shift from seeing it through that lens primarily to seeing it through the prism of the fact that this is a place that dispossesses and oppresses Palestinians?
It's actually quite simple. I met Palestinians. When I was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, I met Palestinian students and I heard the stories of their lives. I was a freshman in college in 2009, right after Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip in that winter 2008 to 2009. And the Goldstone Report was a hotly contested news story at the time. Of course, initially all I knew about it was that it was baseless and biased, echoes of exactly what we're hearing, around the International Court of Justice right now. And then I heard Palestinian students talking about, what it was like to be living in Gaza as the bombs were falling overhead and not being able to sleep for weeks and huddled in the center of their homes with their family members, just hoping that they wouldn't be killed. What it's like to have been beaten at a checkpoint by Israeli soldiers, what it's like to try to go visit your family in Jerusalem when you're born there, but you get discriminated against at the airport and detained for hours. I mean, each one of these stories was so outside of my frame of reference that it was honestly shocking to me. And initially, I went back to my community and was like, I'm hearing all these horrible stories. Like, can someone explain them to me? What do you have to say about these stories? And I really couldn't get a good answer. And that profoundly disturbed me. And I had to go find out more. And I was also, I would say, in addition to hearing it from Palestinian students, I was hearing it from Israelis and other Jews, which also I was like, oh, I thought all Jews were united behind the position that I held. I thought, the idea of Jewish unity is something that's very heavily promoted in pro-Israel circles. Of course, that veneer of unity is always a lie, and always conceals deep disagreements beneath the surface and excludes the people who don't disagree, who don't support that unity. But yeah, that was basically the beginning of a long period of learning and unlearning for me.
Yeah, I'd imagine it would be a long period, but because I'm wondering when you first started encountering these stories, how open were you to hearing what was being said? Because, a lot of people, their initial reaction would be to say, well, this is clearly not true, this person's making this up, or, at least casting doubt on what they're hearing. So I'm wondering what your initial reception was when you started hearing these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to think that they were making them up. I was like, somebody give me a better talking point, please. I desperately want these stories to be made up because I want to be able to hold on to the worldview that I have. And I was I just couldn't get a better answer from anybody. And so then I started to be like, well, what am I missing in this story? I have to start doing this research and, talking to other people and reading on my own. And I quickly realized, oh, they don't have a better answer because they don't actually want to engage with these facts because they're true.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the goal is to actually change the topic, to deflect, to attack, not to engage substantively in the conversation.
So it was basically a mixture of hearing these stories plus sort of trying to get a more comprehensive response from people who are obviously pro-Israel, but then them not really giving it and giving you, re deflective points, effectively not
Yeah,
really refuting what was being said, and effectively that's what.
absolutely. And in the American Jewish community, or I mean, I can say it's like a deeply rooted part of Jewish cultures and tradition for centuries. We have a very rich tradition of intellectual debate. And that's always something that, I was raised to be proud of and to value. And so, you know, and to believe in, human rights and social justice. So much of the story that I was taught was about, you know, Jews in the civil rights movement, Jews, emerging from the ashes of the Holocaust and fighting for a better world for all people. Of course, they don't include the parts of that story that challenge that narrative, of course. But those were values that I was raised to really believe in very deeply, and so, um, I was like, well, it sounds like horrible things are happening to these people. That can't be. I must be against that, or it must not be true, or something. Because I want to stand with people who are oppressed. I I learned from my own people's history that I don't want those things to happen to anybody. But here I am hearing that the state of Israel is committing these crimes against people. That doesn't sound right to me.
Yes, and it's very, I mean, I did you also sort of couple this by visiting Israel, Palestine, and just seeing as well, or was it just primarily when you were living in the US, you were hearing these stories?
No, absolutely. I started going to the West Bank and into occupied East Jerusalem, and seeing, I visited the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and saw a Palestinian family who had been expelled from their home. I saw Jewish settlers strapped with guns, with religious nationalist slogans draped, and Israeli flags draped across the house. And I remember one of the members of the family, the Palestinian family, who were outside of their home, protesting. He pointed to those flags and said to me that that flag to him represented so much strength and such a threat over his own life and his own safety. And that like flipped the whole paradigm for me on its head, because I always understood Israel as weak and beleaguered. And the idea that Israel was strong and actually threatening another people was totally outside of my frame of reference. Um, and then, of course, I started going and seeing what life under occupation looks like. I saw the disparities between what you know the Jewish settlements in the West Bank look like, the access to full services, electricity, water, protection from the army, and the incredible inequality of what Palestinians, sometimes even down the road or right on the opposite hillside, are living under, with the threat of harassment and demolition from the army, the restrictions on freedom of movement. I mean, I saw all those things with my own eyes. And I mean, every time I see it, it shatters something in me anew. I mean, it's a profoundly unjust reality that Israel has created on the ground there. And they've also built the architecture of that reality so that Israelis, for the most part, don't actually have to see it. You know, you can drive on roads and just not have to see Palestinians. The wall is built in such a way that, very often you just don't have to see the worst of it if you're on the Jewish side.
Yes, and I'm wondering also here, when you see this oppression that you talk about that you saw in the West Bank, and you saw the architecture, but you also saw the appropriation of symbols that you grew up identifying with and having a certain meaning to you, Jewish symbols and so on. But now looking at it from the perspective of someone in the West Bank, someone who's Palestinian or even in Gaza, those symbols having a very different meaning. I'm wondering how that must have felt to you when you sort of came to that realization.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I remember meeting a Palestinian activist once who said to me, um, the only Jews that we interact with here are either soldiers or settlers. And that broke my heart because you know, that's his reality, like what I think when we talk about the ways that the state of Israel conflates Zionism and Judaism and wants them all to be the same in order to advance its nationalist project, they've completely co-opted and appropriated all of these symbols of Jewish identity and Jewish tradition, and they've all become symbols of oppression for Palestinians. Even Shabbat now is also a day where settlers go on rampages and harass Palestinians in the hillside, right? Jewish holidays are the days where the army imposes total closure on Palestinian cities and people can't move between the freedom of movement gets even worse. So it's all these, yeah, all these like markers of Judaism that for me as a Jew living abroad are just like, you know, sacred and important parts of my tradition all get used as part of the Israeli state's oppression of Palestinians. And some also like, on there are Jewish holidays where religious nationalists have used some of the meanings of those holidays to use them to justify further violence, further revenge. Not to mention there's the everyday like spray painting, or I mean, even just the Israeli flag, right? The Star of David might mean something to a Jewish person, you know, uh, living in New York or Los Angeles, but that star is basically the star of oppression. It's a symbol of the supremacist domination that Palestinians live under, and it's put in their faces constantly to remind them who has power over their lives and who can take their lives at an instant.
Yes, and when you started, going to these Palestinian territories specifically, I mean, what was when you tell people back home or other people oh, I'm going to this place today, what was their sort of reaction to that? Because, I mean, if you grow up thinking Palestinians are inherently dangerous, the idea that you're going around and willfully spending your time with them, I'd imagine sort of triggers a kind of, well, will you be safe? Are you crazy for doing this?
Yep, I did get asked that question all the time.
And,
Yeah,
how
I
did you?
mean, no, there's a real demonization of Palestinians and the idea that uh, the only thing they want to do is to hurt us and to kill us. It's also a very racist projection because who's the one who actually has the power to hurt and to kill right now? It's mostly Israel. Um, so yeah, I mean, when I visited Palestinian communities, I was really welcomed, right? Because I was coming not to oppress and to dominate, but actually to learn and to engage, and Palestinians were so incredibly welcoming to me whenever I came into their communities. I mean, I often came, with groups and whatnot, but I think there was a real deep, heartfelt desire just to be heard and to be understood by people outside.
Yes, and because I remember, when you would, because I remember when, when I visited Israel Palestine many years ago, and if sometimes I'd have to be in, Israeli cities, Jewish cities like Tel Aviv or whatever, and I'd hear, I'd be sitting in a hostel just listening to people talk about things, and then you would have that naive foreigner who comes and says, "Oh, I've just come back from Hebron on a nice trip," and just every like person in there who's Israeli just looking horrified at this idea that somebody just
Why would you even go there?
yeah. It was an interesting thing to witness. It was really, and I'd imagine as well. I mean, I think my sort of feeling on this is that for you, as someone who lives in America, I feel like maybe you have a bit more of a space in a way to sort of explore these things. Because if you, I mean, there obviously are Israeli activists who are against the occupation and against what's happening, but the bar for them is higher if they dissent against Israel, depending on where they live and what kind of family they have. Because first of all, they're all expected to serve in the military. They're expected to, carry out certain functions of the state. And if you dissent against that, the price you pay is a lot higher. Did
I
you
think
sort
that's
of,
true. Yeah.
because I think what's interesting as well is that we have seen a lot of dissent coming from American Jews, and it seems to be increasing. And I sort of wonder whether that's partly because they have the space to.
Yeah, I mean, I often feel that abroad, we definitely have the privilege of not being on the ground. Also, let's be clear that the Israeli government has very actively persecuted human rights defenders and human rights organizations who, even just doing the basic work of documenting abuses against Palestinians is something that there's been very severe attempts at incitement and repression from the state. So that's the context that Israeli leftists are operating in. And yes, not to mention just this overwhelming environment of if you speak out, you're a traitor. And the threat of violence from, the Israeli society is incredibly right wing. So the American Jewish community is overwhelmingly much more liberal. We also have the privilege of the distance. I think it's both the distance and the fact that, like, from where I'm sitting, I feel like I have the ability to read many more news sources, to understand a much more objective, fuller picture of what's going on the ground. The Israeli military very heavily censors information about what's going on in the occupied territories. I mean, right now, Israelis know just so much less about what's going on in Gaza right now than American Jews do, because we are reading about it in international media that Israelis are not reading. I mean, even Haaretz, who does incredible reporting and has done some really important investigative work, is not covering the atrocities in Gaza as much as other publications abroad are.
Yes, but I think also in the Israeli case, from what I was reading, there's a calculation being made that if they cover it too much, they feel their prime audience will just react against them for posting this sort of stuff. But it's created a place where there's incredible ignorance about what's happening in Gaza. And I think in part when you see these videos that fly around on social media of Israelis saying some really horrible stuff, average people saying horrible stuff, horrific stuff, saying we're not being hard enough. And we're obviously in the outside, we're seeing all this horrific images. They're not seeing it in Israel, so they think they're being light because they're not seeing these images.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that sort of brings us to the film Israelism, which I actually watched over the Christmas holidays. It was a very good film, very interesting. So I'm wondering though, how did this sort of film come about?
Well, I didn't make the film, I'm just in it.
How did you
Um,
become the star of it then?
um, yeah, I think the filmmakers were talking to a lot of different American Jews and activists, and they they found my story compelling. So here I am.
Indeed. And what was the experience like, having a camera crew follow you around all that time?
I've been an activist, ever since I got politicized in college. I've been working to try to, wake my community up to the reality of the Palestinian experience and to the incredible injustice being perpetrated by Israel. And it's it's incredibly meaningful and gratifying that the story, my story, every single time this film is shown, I have people who come up to me afterwards, young Jews who are like, that's my story too. And also older Jews who are like, this is my story, but this happened to me decades ago, and I was attacked and I was so much more marginalized for all these things. So it's also important to say that there's always been a dissenting opinions in the American Jewish community and in the world Jewish community. There has never been a consensus behind Zionism or behind the Israeli government's policies. And so I just think so many American Jews are so grateful to hear their stories reflected and to be shown to a broader audience. And it's helping more and more people have those hard conversations in their families and in their communities.
Yeah, so, and this film, you're touring around, well, filmmakers are touring around with it, and it's being seen everywhere. So what's that sort of experience been like? I mean, I know you're probably not going physically to all these places, but you're obviously getting feedback and interactions with people um, from seeing this film.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I have people who come up to me after every single screening. I get messages on social media of people, not just Jews, but people of all backgrounds, thanking me for sharing my story and, thanking me for uplifting this view that, is just receives less, is less prominently featured in our media. The strategy of the Israeli government, the public relations strategy of the Israeli government relies on projecting this idea that there's worldwide Jewish unity behind their policies. And so this growing movement of Jews around the world, specifically American Jews, who are so outspoken and critical of the government, who believe that there should have been a ceasefire a long time ago, who see the atrocities in Gaza and feel heartbroken and outraged and feel solidarity with the Palestinian people of Gaza, and are outraged that any of this is being done in our names. That really shatters the strategy that the Israeli government has of saying that any criticism of them is anti-Semitic, because you have thousands of Jews around the world saying, "How dare you?"
Yes, and and they've obviously been using this line, and then any Jews who dissent against them, they obviously get accused of various things as well. So there's that. But I'm wondering then, thinking about post October 7th, and obviously the war in Gaza is currently going on. What has been, because we've seen something of, as the opinion poll I've read out in the intro, something of a divide emerging. So what has been the conversation like around what's happening in Gaza right now in Jewish communities in America?
Yeah, well, polling regularly shows that there's a much wider diversity of opinion in the American Jewish community, again, than is represented both by the Israeli government, but also by, establishment Jewish organizations. I mean, there's thousands, if not tens of thousands, of American Jews who are protesting for a ceasefire right now. They are not represented by some of the loudest and most powerful institutions of American Jewish life, but we exist. We're organizing. We're out there. And the polling shows it. So, since the beginning of this, and especially among young Jews, majorities of young Jews, this was, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that historic poll that showed over 30% of young Jews think Israel's an apartheid state, and also a sizable number who believed that Israel was committing genocide before Israel actually was, openly declaring its intention to commit genocide in the Gaza Strip right now. So,
But why do you think this shift has started to happen? I mean, you gave us your own story, but why do you think there is now a chasm opening up? I mean, as I think you've mentioned as well, American Jews tend towards liberalism and tend to be more progressive. And I think a lot of a lot of surveys done seem to show that as well. When it comes to various social issues, political issues, they tend to be towards the left, not necessarily the left, but towards the left on a lot of issues.
mm-hmm.
And it also, it's always seemed a bit strange when you look at the politics of various American Jewish organizations, which are more conservative, and then you see the opinion polls showing that this is not actually a very conservative group in many ways. There's a huge kind of mismatch there. But why do you think this chasm is opening up more and more now?
I mean, to me, there's actually a very simple answer to this in many ways, which is that young Jews are watching young Palestinians in Gaza live streaming these atrocities from their phones directly to our phones. And we are watching every single day people who look like us, who want the same things as we do, who just want to be able to live, safe, normal, free lives, narrating the just, I mean, it's beyond words, the level of horrors that we're seeing right now. And I I think most young Jews who are watching this, who aren't, immediately turning to the knee jerk, Hasbara, are seeing this and are just outraged and disgusted. And we're also seeing those videos that you mentioned. We're also seeing these videos of Israeli soldiers who are just posting on TikTok, videos of these parties where they are just, singing these genocidal chants, getting themselves pumped up for battle. These videos of Israeli soldiers just committing war crimes and celebrating them. These videos. There's this genre, I guess, of these soldiers blowing up buildings and then standing by like it's super cool, like they're in an action movie. I mean, the degree of like pride and nonchalance of how Israeli soldiers have just been posting and and in Palestinian homes in Gaza, all these videos. I think that a lot of young American Jews, like young Americans broadly, are seeing these videos and they can't stand by it.
So for you, I mean, social media is a very weird place, let's just say that. But for you, then, do you feel that this is something that's happening because of what's happened since October 7th? Or do you feel there was something building up in relation to how a young American Jews see Israel in the run-up to all of what's been happening?
It seems undeniable to me that the momentum we're seeing right now is the result of decades of organizing for Palestinian rights in the US and around the world. So I don't think that this came out of nowhere. And I think that the people, there are a lot of people who are getting activated for the first time right now. Absolutely. They're saying that this is a, historic. The amount that we're all seeing the atrocities directly on our phones is historic. And I think that, I can just say for a lot of young Jews, like they already knew that something was wrong over there, right? Maybe they heard about Israeli apartheid. Maybe they knew about human rights violations in the West Bank. Every day in 2023, the Israeli military killed a Palestinian in the West Bank. There was, this for the last year, alongside the historic protests that were happening in Israeli society, was also historic levels of incitement by this new, the most extremist government in Israeli history. And I think a lot of the people protesting right now have actually been following a lot of that and have seen the writings on the wall. They've heard the Israeli government openly declare, its commitment to escalate its violent assault on the Palestinian people. And so October 7th, as absolutely horrific and unconscionable as that day was, and in my community, so many of us are directly connected to people who were impacted on that day, who lost loved ones, who are connected to the hostages. I mean, this is very close to home for so many of us. And we know that, on October 6th, it's not like nothing was going on in that place. And I think there's a pretty significant divide between people who have been paying close attention and understanding that this escalating situation on the ground was unsustainable on October 6th and well before that, to people who want to say that October 7th is the day that all the context began.
Yes, because my feeling is as well is that, if you're looking at this from the US and you're looking at the way Israeli government officials are talking about Gaza and whether it's the frantic denial of what's happening there or whatever, there's an element that feels like it's very much, we've seen this before, it looks like manga hat nationalism, as some people call it, a very Trumpian-esque type denial. And I sort
Yeah,
of
I mean,
wonder,
it's like an alternative reality with alternative facts. I think that's absolutely true.
because I'm also, as you were talking and you were thinking about, I think a lot of the decades of activism you've talked about is definitely a huge factor in the fact that we can access people in Gaza on TikTok. You've had a lot of Palestinian journalists on TikTok who have been very vocal, and young men and women, who look very normal and ordinary. And there's no way you can tell anyone otherwise that these are Hamas people or whatever, Jerusalem Post try to do there.
Yeah.
But I think also, just the mental image. I mean, for example, you'll remember when after Trump was elected, Netanyahu flew over, those images of them standing together. I imagine all of those contributed factors meant that people were like, well, hang on a minute, what is this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the Israeli rights open alliance with some of the most racist, authoritarian, and even anti-Semitic leaders in the world calls into question for a lot of Jews abroad, are these people actually acting in the interest of my well-being? And are these people helping create a world in which I, as a Jewish person, am safer? I think a lot of people see right through that. And they see that Netanyahu is not acting in any of our interests. He's acting in his own interests. And his agenda, which is a extremist, racist agenda, is becoming more and more clear to so many more people.
And lastly, so what do you see as the future of what's going to happen in sort of Israel, Palestine? What do you hope the future will be? And in addition to that, what do you see as the American Jewish community's role in that future?
I'm not sure I can give you a prediction for what the future will hold. I mean, this is just a moment of such deep devastation on the ground. What's happening in Gaza, what it would take even just to rehabilitate and rebuild after this level of destruction it's almost unimaginable. I can say I'm just really hoping that the International Court of Justice, that there can be, mechanisms for upholding international law, for calling for a ceasefire. And I hope that more and more American Jews will see that this is a moment that they absolutely have to begin supporting the movement for justice and equality for all people in Palestine and in Israel. There's no future of safety for anyone, Jews or Palestinians, without dismantling these systems of supremacy and domination and building, a genuine future of equality and justice for all people and freedom.
I think we can all hope that there is going to be a better future along the lines you describe. Simone Zimmerman, I would like to thank you for coming on Memo Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do, if you have missed this episode or would like to catch up with others, please go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.